Good morning, everyone. We will just give it a few minutes. People are just slowly virtually filing into the plenary room, so we'll let people hop on and then we'll start in probably maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Okay, I think for the interest of time, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rob Chester, president of the ISAC Winnipeg chapter, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the 2021 edition of the Western Canada Information Security Conference, brought to you by ISAC Winnipeg, along with this year's title sponsor, Palo Alto Networks. For those of you keeping score at home, this is actually our 18th and first ever virtual edition of this event. So we're excited on a few fronts, mainly that we were able to get an event this year. As much as we all would have loved to have this year's event be a chance to reconnect in person, unfortunately, that's just not an option at this time. Before I go any further and talk about the event a little bit and some of the details, I want to start off with a few thank yous. It's really important. First off, I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. It is not lost on me how complicated schedules and routines have become. I know I experienced it firsthand myself, so it means a lot that you're able to join us. Secondly, to the 29 sponsoring organizations who showed up in the middle of a global pandemic and continue to offer their support for this event, thank you. It's the support from the vendor community coupled with the amazing support from all of our attendees that not only made this year's event possible, but it allows us to put this event on year after year, and it's really critical. And honestly, it's supportive community events like that that makes up for those 6 a.m. cold sales calls. And lastly, but certainly not least, I want to thank the team that put this all together. The WCISC organizing committee made up of Mark Morrison, Ricardo Almostino, Kyle Malotkin, and led by this year's conference chair, John Lamb. I can't even begin to tell you the countless hours that go into planning these events. I've done it myself. I've been at the heart of it. It is incredibly taxing, but it's incredibly worthwhile. If you've ever done it before, you get it. And if you haven't, well, come stop by the ISACA virtual booth and put your name down for next year. It's a lot of fun. So over these next 2 days, I hope you're able to accomplish 3 things, if nothing else. First off, enjoy and experience everything that this virtual edition of the conference brings, from the many talks on the wide-ranging variety of topics to interacting with, as many people on as many topics as you can. Hopefully you've been able to customize and cram your agenda full of talks for the next 2 days. I know I've selected mine of interest already. Secondly, interact with the vendor community. This is really important. You heard me earlier talk about how important it is for the vendor support, because without that, we just can't make this happen. But, there's plenty of breaks between the sessions. Make sure you stop by the virtual vendor village, check out the vendor booths, talk with your sales rep, reconnect with new ones, find out what's new. And in case you needed a little extra nudge to drop by and say hi, ISACA Winnipeg has actually put together $1,000 in Amazon gift cards to give away in the form of 20 $50 gift cards. So I haven't checked the latest registration numbers, but I'll tell you, there's some pretty good odds there to come home with a $50 gift card. And the more booths you visit, the better your chances are to win. So get in there, check things out, fill your virtual swag bags full of stuff, and just check it all out. And then lastly, or number 3, probably the most important one to me, is interact and visit with your peers. The peer community is really important. It helps with that, thought leadership and, just building our industries and building our knowledge, and just, there's some solace in being able to just connect with your peers and just, share challenges and share successes. We actually have a networking function built into the platform. If you had a chance to check it out, if not, I highly recommend you go in there and do. There's text chat, voice calls, and video calls. You can make it all directly through the chat function. I don't think anybody listening right now needs me to sit up here and remind them of what a difficult year it's been. My initial thought or ask was to talk a little bit about the year in reflection, and kind of how we've come here. I'm going to go off script a little bit and actually not talk about that because, like I just said, you don't need me telling you how horrible the year's been. Or maybe I'm exaggerating in some cases, but I'll tell you honestly, if I'm summing up the last year, it hasn't been great. And you certainly don't need me to talk about the transformational changes our industries have experienced. I'm sure you'll hear vendors talk about it in some of the speaks, and I'm sure your peers can talk about some stuff, but you've probably been living it yourself as well. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not sure how much COVID lexicon or home office pictures on LinkedIn I can handle before I find out how far I can actually throw my keyboard. As a side note, if my boss is listening, because he's actually probably on this call, that keyboard request I put in is completely unrelated. But all joking aside, it's been tough. I know we've been sacrificing a lot to stay safe. And through this, now let's take some time. Let's get back to some of the, this is not normal because this is certainly different than we've ever done it before. But let's try to do some normal things. Let's try to interact in the normal ways we used to. And let's try to get from this conference the topics, the wide-ranging variety of speaks and the peer interaction. Let's get the most of it like we did before, and let's just really enjoy it. And to be honest with that, I'm going to keep it short and sweet because I know you didn't pay well, no, nobody paid because this year's free. So maybe you're getting your money's worth from my speak, but I know you certainly didn't come here to hear me speak. So with that, I'd like to actually introduce our first speaker of the day, who's Ryan Olson. Ryan is the Vice President of Threat Intelligence for Unit 42, which is a cybersecurity consulting group that brings together world-class threat researchers and elite incident responders to protect enterprises against the latest cyber threats. His area of expertise is detecting and identifying actors and groups conducting cybercrime and cyber espionage operations. Ryan is contributing author to the book Cyber Fraud, Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, and primary author of Cybersecurity Essentials. I've had the chance to hear Ryan speak already a few times. I'll tell you, he's fantastic. I always love going before the great ones and not after them because it's a hard act to follow. So without any further ado, I present you, Ryan.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, got my slides up. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you this morning. Echo Rob's thoughts on it's been one heck of an interesting year. A lot of challenges that we've all had to overcome. A lot of people working from home, and I'll tell you, the bad guys didn't sit still and do nothing for the year, which all of you are already aware of. There's been a lot of opportunity for threat actors to attack our networks, to attack our organizations, to steal money, and to take other kinds of steps to harm our enterprises. And today, what I want to talk with you about is a report that we published last month on our analysis of ransomware, how it's changed over time, and specifically our findings from investigating a large number of ransomware incidents, as well as data from different types of leak sites. So that's going to be our primary topic. Encourage you all to ask questions through the Q&A function that's in Zoom. If appropriate, I'll try to answer them as I'm going through my session. Otherwise, I've reserved some time at the end, which hopefully we can answer some questions for you there as we get to them. Just starting off, I want to give a little introduction to my team, just so you have some idea of who we are and what we do. If you haven't heard of Unit 42 already, we're the Palo Alto Networks Threat Intelligence team. I joined Palo Alto Networks in 2014. I'd been working in private threat intelligence for other companies for about 8 years prior to that. And I've spent the last 7 years here at Palo Alto Networks, specifically leading this group that's dedicated to looking at all the data that we have across the platform, from next generation firewalls to endpoint data to cloud data, to understand adversaries. How are they attacking our customers? What can we do to defend against them? And quite frankly, sharing that information with people who can use it. In some cases, that's inside our company to help make products better. In other cases, it's by going and publishing the research that we've done so that we can help people truly understand the threats that they are facing a little bit better. Most of the research that we perform that is public goes to the Unit 42 website, unit42.paloaltonetworks.com. We've published just short, I think, of 700 reports there in the 7 years that I've been here. So there's a lot of content about a lot of different topics. including ransomware, but also cloud threats, nation state threats, new vulnerabilities, and pretty much everything else you might imagine that an organization like Palo Alto Networks has insight into and is helping people defend against. Last month, we announced some changes for Unit 42, as well as a new logo, which I already have on this hoodie right here. We acquired a company called Crypsis late last year, who is an incident response security consulting firm. And as we brought them into the fold, what we realized was that the work that they were doing and the work that our threat intelligence team was doing really were sort of two sides of the same coin. We were investigating threats on the threat intel team from the perspective of what are we seeing from how attacks are hitting devices and how are we blocking them and how are we ensuring they don't make their way through. And they were looking at that from the other side of the table after the organization has already been compromised. What is the actor doing at that point? What are they trying to achieve? So it made a lot of sense for us to combine these two groups together into a single group under the banner of Unit 42. And that's what we announced last month. And that is where the team fits together now, which is why we've got this new logo here. And it's truly been a huge opportunity for us to be able to get new insight into the types of challenges that an incident responder deals with across a large number of cases for all types of different threats. And the data that was included in the report I'm going to talk through, a lot of it actually came directly from those incident response engagements that were run by the former Crypsis team, now Unit 42 Security Consulting. If you don't know where the 42 comes from, I feel like it's a requirement these last 7 years for me to have to explain it to make sure people understand. Unit 42 was originally named by the Palo Alto Networks CSO, 7-8 years ago. And at the time, he was trying to explain and write documentation for why do we need a threat intelligence team at Palo Alto Networks. And as he was writing this out and explaining what kind of skills we're going to need, what kind of data we need access to, he was originally sort of just calling it Palo Alto Networks Threat Intelligence Team, which is a really long name and not a great acronym. And instead, he started using Unit 42 as shorthand. And the 42 comes from this book and eventually movie, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you're not familiar with it, it's a science fiction comedy book. It's very funny. It's very nerdy, as are most of the people in my team, nerdy, not necessarily funny. 42 in the book is the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And our former CSO, Rick, he thought that was a pretty good way to describe the mission that he thought this team was going to take on. And that's why we've been using that moniker ever since. A couple of years ago, this came up though, and we had to make a slight distinction. We are not this Unit 42. If you've seen, there's a show that's actually, I believe it's a Belgian show that's been dubbed into English and it's on Netflix now called Unit 42, which is about a group of police officers who primarily track cybercrime. It is okay as far as cyber cop shows go, but it's not based on us. It's a completely different formation of the name. So just to clarify that in case anyone wonders, do we have any involvement with it? We don't. I don't get like an executive producer credit on it because we had the same name, but it is pretty fun to see that that show and sort of watch through it as well. All right, so with that as the introduction, I want to start talking about our primary topic here, which is ransomware. Ransomware as a threat isn't news to anybody. It's actually if you ever want to have a simple task for someone, ask them to go and find headlines related to ransomware incidents. Since 2013, we have seen a massive ramp up in the number of ransomware attacks. We saw ransomware has a much longer history as a threat than really these just last 8 years. But in the last 8 years, we saw ransomware transition from being a type of malware to a criminal business model. And I'll talk through that a little bit about how it works and sort of what the impact of that is. But there is no single industry that's impacted by ransomware. It hits everyone. It is transitioned from being an attack that primarily hit individuals and their systems at home to being one that's almost entirely targeted at enterprises and organizations who have a much bigger budget to go and pay. And the amount of impact the threat has really can't be underestimated. To a single organization, a municipality, let's say, who's been compromised and had their emergency services shut down, hospitals being shut down so that people are not able to, doctors aren't able to provide care to patients because they're not able to access the information systems that are required to do that appropriately, to pipelines. As we've seen in the news just the last couple of days, you can have a massive impact to an organization by denying them access to their data, which is truly the core of what ransomware is about. And it's not about a piece of malware. It's not about a technical challenge. It's really about adversaries who have a mission in their mind, which is making money, and then pursuing this form of cyber extortion to make that money from whoever they can get it from. So let's walk through a little bit on why I would describe this as a criminal business model before we dive into the report and the stats. As I said, it's not about a piece of malware. And I think the name ransomware has become a little bit challenging to use because this is truly cyber extortion. This is about extorting people by holding something over their head. And that has evolved over time, as well as how they achieve this. But there's really 5 steps to a ransomware attack. And those 5 steps can be achievable in a lot of different ways. The first one always starts with taking control over a system or taking control over some data. And this typically happens through an intrusion into the network, access to systems through common means. And we'll talk through what some of those means are, but this is really just about taking control of the system. That's the key. The second thing is denying access to the system, and more commonly now also exfiltrating data from it. If you can take control of the system and then deny access to it, you are well on your way to be able to conduct a ransomware attack. That doesn't mean it has to be a Windows system or a Mac or any kind of computer necessarily that you're thinking of. You could take control over a refrigerator, and if you can deny access to it, you're on your way to being able to launch a ransomware attack. The third step is being able to demand a ransom. You've got to be able to communicate with the victim and say, hey, you need to pay us this amount of money. However that means might be for conveying that, you've got to actually be able to demand that ransom. And that you can do through lots of different systems as well. We commonly see it through notes that are dropped on systems after the data is encrypted. In other cases, images, pop-ups, other things like that, but demand the ransom. And then these last 2 steps are really crucial. You got to be able to collect the payment. In the early days of ransomware, before we sort of 2013, where we started started seeing attackers use cryptocurrency to accept payments, Bitcoin and Monero and other currencies that are available today. Oftentimes they had to do this with credit card payments instead, or transfer through different types of money transfer systems. And they had to find a way to actually get that cash. That is a key element, or this business model breaks down. And then finally, and this is really key, they have to actually do what they said they were going to do. The bad guys got to give you back access to your system for this model to work. And that doesn't mean it happens in every case. Sometimes people pay ransom, they don't get their files back. But if that was the common case where people were paying and they weren't getting their files back, this whole model would fall apart. This is a model that's applicable across all types of systems. It doesn't matter if it's a computer that's sitting on your desktop, a system that's in the cloud, a network of self-driving vehicles, a pipeline operation, whatever it might be. If you can follow through this cycle, an attacker can make money off of this because they can extort you and prevent you from getting access to your system. And a lot of people at that point are more willing to pay up. So I think that's just helpful for setting sort of a frame of reference on what is ransomware, so that you're not thinking about it as a particular malware family or something that's spreading sort of mindlessly through the internet. This is really about actors who are trying to execute their criminal business model. So let's dive into the data a little bit. We published this report last month. It's available online. If you search for Unit 42 ransomware threat report, you'll certainly find it. But there's a few key trends that we identified, and I'll talk about where the data came from in just a moment. These are some really big numbers, like crazy big compared to what we used to see for ransomware. The average ransom demand, and this is against enterprises because that's who we're typically working with, in 2020 was $847,000. So this is the average. At the top, you can see another stat there. $30 million was the highest ransom demand that we saw in 2020. That has already been exceeded this year. There's been a $50 million ransom that was demanded. These are enormous numbers as far as what the cost is to an organization, and that means the profit to the attacker who's actually launching these. Continuing to increase The average ransom that was actually paid was up 171% from last year, from somewhere in the hundreds of thousands to $312,000 on average. That means that operation that they ran netted them a huge chunk of cash that had to be transferred to them for someone to get their system back. And the highest ransom that we're aware of that was actually paid in 2020 was 10 million, which doubled what we saw in 2019 at 5 million. So we're seeing this continued increase in the amount that is demanded by attackers, the amount that then is being paid by attackers, although most people aren't paying exactly what was demanded, that gets negotiated down. But the numbers continue to go up. And there's a few different reasons for that. One is the rise of double extortion. So this note here at the bottom about double extortion on the rise, if you're not familiar with double extortion, the idea is you don't just encrypt the data, but you also exfiltrate the data outside of the network. And then in addition to telling the victim, we've locked up your files, you can't access them. We've blocked your database, whatever it might be. You also threaten to share that information publicly so that people have the fear that that information is going to leak, which really was a innovation, I'll say, on behalf of the attackers to get around the fact that if someone previously had good backup systems that they could recover to, they would be able to get around paying the ransom. But the threat of extortion on top of that provides that additional emphasis to get them to actually convey, to pay up. And that's also provided us some additional data on how these attacks are actually, how widespread they are and the organizations that are being impacted. Here's where most of the data for this report came from. So first, the consulting team in Unit 42 has run in 2019, 2020, 252 specific ransomware investigations where a client was impacted and they had ransomware inside their network. They were being extorted, and we could learn from those cases to be able to say, what did this attack actually look like and what was the impact? And the second thing was ransomware leak sites. So when one of these double extortion cases comes up, the attackers have sort of dark web mechanisms to be able to post, here's who we've compromised, and oftentimes here's what data we've stolen, 100 gigabytes, whatever it might be, and some characterization of what that data is. And this is all part of their threat. If they can demonstrate that how much data was taken and what it consists of, they can make it more clear to the victim that they've really got to pay up. So we were able to find across all these ransomware leak sites, 337 victims across 56 industries all around the world, where we have information about who they are and what their impact is. So as I go through the rest of the data from the report, you're going to see this broken out in two different ways. Some is going to be about the types of malware that are being deployed, the types of techniques that were used. That is things that we've learned from the aggregate across all of these investigations. And then when we're talking about the victims who are being impacted and the locations and the industries they're in, a lot of that information is coming from these ransomware leak sites. All right, let me continue diving into this data. This is the victim organizations as far as the count of organizations based off the leak sites. So these are organizations who were impacted with double extortion. So their data was stolen and they're being told, we're going to leak this information publicly if you don't pay up. And this is just a breakdown by country. And this is what we commonly see from a leak site perspective, as well as what we think the overall sort of impact of organizations is as well. The United States is at the top of the list, but number 2 is Canada. Canada's number 2 from this isn't just, based off Palo Alto Network's customer base, this is globally, what are we seeing from these leak sites? So who are these top actors who are getting the largest payments targeting? And they're really not just going after the entire planet at once. There's a rather specific set that they're actually going and looking at. The United States, Canada, Germany, and the UK round out the top 4. What you can see is notably absent is not a lot in Russia and Eastern Europe. One of the things that we've learned from looking at these investigations is oftentimes it appears the attacker is coming out of Russia, coming out of Eastern Europe. And with that being where they're launching their attack from, they may actually filter who they may impact based off of the locale of the systems. They may actually look, is this a Russian-speaking system that I'm compromising? And if they see that, they will not infect the system and they'll move on to find something else. All right. This doesn't mean everybody else in these sort of white blobs here is not going to be impacted though. Ransomware, as I said, is a business model. It can be launched by anyone. It doesn't need to be just by launch with people who have a particular locale in mind. Any organization has data that is valuable. And if somebody puts value on their data, that means that controlling that data and using it is going to be valuable to them as well. And if you can stop that, you can convince them into paying up. And that's really the message that I want to make sure that people get, is this is an impact that could really hit anybody, but this is where we see it the most. From a delivery perspective, there is not a single way that ransomware attacks occur. And that's another way that it's helpful to think about this, not as a type of attack, but as a business model. But there are a few that are much more common than others that we've learned from our investigations. So the first one that we see as far as the initial intrusion, and this isn't, they deployed some ransomware and it does all its stuff and it's automated. These attacks are typically conducted by an adversary with hands-on keyboard. They get inside the network, they get control over a single system, they map out the network to understand where is the best data, where is the data that if they were to shut it down, they could cause the most harm to the organization and then put the most leverage on them. But this is that initial vector. So we see a couple different things. One is exploiting application vulnerabilities. And this is against servers that are hosted on the internet. And one example I can give you from recent attacks is the recent Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. At the beginning of March, Microsoft patched 4 vulnerabilities related to Microsoft Exchange. Each one of these, or combined in tandem, would allow an attacker to, without any authentication, take complete control over the Exchange server, get administrator access. And what we saw at the beginning of March was widespread compromise of all these systems. Tens of thousands of Exchange servers being compromised through automation by an attacker who didn't necessarily know what they were compromising other than it was Exchange server. In some cases, they did know very well, but we saw this sort of broadly. And then, at least in a small number of cases, and we may see more in the future, they went to a ransomware payload. They would shift over and say, okay, I've got an Exchange server. What can I now deploy that can earn me some money by encrypting the data that's on this Exchange server, which is obviously providing email services and other services to the organization, and then hit them for ransom. We don't just see Exchange, obviously. Any kind of server vulnerability on a server that's commonly public facing and that's going to be on a port that has to be exposed to the internet, to the service port that that machine is needs to allow access for. In the Exchange case, it was for Outlook web access. We're going to see exploitation of that, and the common, at least criminal use of it is going to be for ransomware. So that's really one of the key ways that, as far as defending those servers, patching obviously is important, but blocking the vulnerabilities from being exploited is also key. The second thing that we've seen a lot in 2020, and part of that may be due to the pandemic and more people working from home, but was more systems that were compromised through RDP and other remote access protocols, but primarily through RDP. And oftentimes the RDP was exposed on a Windows server because somebody needed to access it remotely. We saw an increase in this in 2020, likely because people needed to access them from home, and they opened up a port to allow access, whereas they may have done that previously, either from a data center or from the location where the server was hosted, if it was in an office. And with that exposure meant that all somebody needed in many cases to access that Windows server was the username and password for that user, if there is no multi-factor authentication, which most people were not employing. With that, if someone was able to steal that username and password or guess that username and password, they could then log into the system and use it and conduct a ransomware attack against it. And I'll tell you, RDP is very commonly scanned across the internet. People are constantly looking for open RDP so that they can then try common credentials against them, or credentials that they've purchased on underground forums or found through other means. We once conducted an experiment by just putting a Windows server out on the internet, sort of like a honeypot that we were actively monitoring. We left RDP open on it. We had sort of easy to guess credentials that were deployed to it as well. Within a very short period of time, someone logged into it and we saw them do 2 things immediately. The first thing, and this was 3 years ago when we conducted the experiment, the first thing was that they scanned the system for credit card data. So they were looking for software that might be used by point of sale systems and everything else. That scan was automated. It took them seconds to get that done. As soon as that was completed and they found no credit card data, they deployed ransomware on the system. They didn't even know if there was valuable data on the system, but is understanding that no one puts a system on the internet without some valuable data in it and some value to them. They know that ransomware is an effective way to shut it down. So RDP, also very common. And then the third one, and this is one for how we see a lot of malware distributed in general, is through phishing campaigns. Users continue to be one of the easiest ways for an attacker to get inside a network by sending an email that contains either a link or a file attached, which can then deploy some sort of additional payload inside the network. And this isn't typically going to be ransomware at first. Normally, that initial file that comes in through the phishing campaign is going to enable access to the system. It's more of a backdoor, a Trojan that will allow the attacker to communicate with it and send instructions. It's going to be later that they actually deploy the ransomware, either by spreading it across many systems inside the network to encrypt all of them, or to target specific servers where they have identified that data is there and they can encrypt it to put some more pressure on the victim. I can see some questions coming in related to the Colonial Pipeline attack. I'm going to address those at the end for a little bit, because I think we've got a few of them, and I'll hit them all together. If you've got questions, though, please continue sending the Q&A, and I'll keep talking as we go through. This based off the same data from the leak sites, where we saw the types of organizations who had their information exposed or threatened to be exposed, but broken down by sector. And this isn't necessarily how people would expect this data to look. Top of the list here is manufacturing, followed by professional legal services, construction, high tech. These are not the types of spaces where you necessarily think of them as relying really heavily on computers. But this isn't about the computers. This is entirely about how can you put pressure on an organization who you've compromised to get them to pay up. When it comes to manufacturing, if you can put pressure on an organization by shutting down the IT systems that enable the operation, that costs them money, and the attackers know that. The same is true for professional legal services, but on the extortion side. If a law firm is compromised and data is stolen from their clients, they may be much more willing to pay up to prevent that from being exposed. So that becomes a targeting element for them. Lower down the list, you can see healthcare. Many of you probably heard about the trend that we saw a few years ago of attacks specifically against hospitals and hospitals and the data that they were storing. We've seen that trend change a little bit over time. During the pandemic, we saw a couple different threat actors who specifically said they were not going to go and target healthcare systems because they were trying to at least give the impression that they were good guys. Obviously not good guys, criminals, but they wanted to convey that. We still see healthcare pretty high on this list, but definitely not at the top, which is where they were a few years ago. But these attacks continue. As you look across the rest of these, there isn't like a single sector that you'd say, hey, they're not going to be impacted. Semiconductors, for instance, down here with just a single attack. That doesn't mean that these organizations are going to be not targeted in the future or less targeted. The attackers behind ransomware, and there are many of them, this is not sort of one monolithic group, are oftentimes very opportunistic. So if there's a particular type of software that an industry uses very heavily, and it typically has that software that's exposed to the internet, once that's discovered and a vulnerability is in it, many attackers will go and try to take advantage of it at once. The same way that organizations who move their infrastructure from a data center to the public cloud, that doesn't necessarily make them more secure either. We've seen attacks out in the cloud just as we've seen against systems that are inside of data centers. So lots of variability across these different sectors. One question that came in from Ernest, where do water and wastewater utilities fall? I don't think we saw any of them that fell into these categories, at least not that's clear to me based off the leak site data. So one thing to note is this is based off those few hundred organizations who actually were compromised and their data was threatened to be leaked. The ransomware issue overall is much, much larger than this. There are thousands of organizations who are impacted every year, but these are the ones who are specifically impacted with double extortion. So it is a subset of that. So we might not capture every single organization who might have been impacted. So thanks for the question, Ernest. All right. I'm going to move on to our next section here. And this is a breakdown from the same perspective on victim organizations by ransomware family. So each of these names of these malware families, NetWalker, RagnarLocker, Doppelpaymer, they all have just crazy names that are typically chosen by the attacker. They all have varied impacts. Over the years, we have identified literally hundreds of different families of ransomware. And we classify a family of ransomware based off of the various functionality that it has. How does it encrypt files? Oftentimes, how does it display the ransomware message to the victim? How does it communicate with its command and control server? There's actually sort of a dance that needs to happen to ensure that a file that is executing on your system, a piece of a ransomware executable, as it's encrypting the data, it needs to be able to do so in a way that you won't, that limits the ability for someone to capture the keys from the system in case they wanted to go and decrypt the files without paying the ransom. So there's a lot of, I'll say, technology that goes into the development of ransomware. And there's a lot of the business model as well. Many of these families that are listed here, NetWalker right at the top, DarkSide and Revil, a few of the others, they're really ransomware as a service operations. They're not a single attacker who is, writing ransomware and going and deploying it. They work through affiliate programs where they do the work around developing the ransomware, keeping it up to date, trying to evade companies like ours from actually detecting them. But then they work with what they call affiliates who then bring them compromised networks. So they can bring the information to them, they can deploy the ransomware into it, and they can have a sort of a form of profit sharing that happens through that. Ransomware as a service is absolutely something that continues to grow. It's one of the bigger trends that we're seeing, and it's also something that we'll see enabled, enabling the evolution of how the threat actually works. All right, just checking to see if there's any questions on here. All right, let me go ahead and jump to our next slide. One of the things that we included with the ransomware paper this year, as well as lots of other stats like the ones that I've included, is what we call a threat assessment of each of the top families. These are the ones that we saw not necessarily most commonly used in the cases that we worked, but the ones that were most commonly being detected and blocked by the Palo Alto Networks Wildfire system. Wildfire, if you're not familiar, is our big malware analysis system. We've got tens of thousands of customers who are using it, feeding files in from their next generation firewalls and from their endpoints. And based off that, we can see statistically which ones are more common than others. And these were the top 10 that we identified over the course of 2020. So what our threat assessments do, and you can find them on the Unit 42 website, if you search for a threat assessment for any of these names, break down not just what is the malware, how is it commonly deployed, what are the common ways that it's actually distributed, but also how does its command and control mechanism work, how does its encryption work, what are the ways that the ransom message is actually conveyed to the user, as well as a breakdown of all the attack techniques that are employed by that malware and by that operator. MITRE's, when I say attack there, I mean MITRE's attack framework, the framework for breaking down adversary tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. As we see that breakdown for these actors, we can actually map those to defenses, courses of action that you can take to defend against those attackers in the future. So each one of these threat assessments does exactly that. It will take Wasted Locker, convert that into the common techniques that are employed by the group that's using that malware, and then shift that over to, you need to make sure that you're taking these actions from a defensive perspective on your firewall and on your other systems. All right. Let me go ahead a little bit more talking about defense against ransomware, because we've got some good guidance to people on exactly how to achieve this. And I'm not going to say that every ransomware attack could have been stopped. There's no need to blame the folks who are really the victims in this case of these attacks, but nothing that I just described as far as how the malware gets into the network is magic. These are not new advanced techniques that no one could have identified. Having a RDP server that's exposed to the internet that has easily guessable credentials isn't a high bar for us to set. But there are a lot of things that you can do to defend against these threats. And typically what we suggest is that people start at the network layer to defend against this. That really comes down to having something at the edge of the network and in your control points where you can see the traffic that's coming in and out and inspect that for whether or not something's actually malicious and generally have control over it. One of the key things for that is to focus on SSL and TLS traffic itself. Many networks are, the vast majority of the traffic that's passing through them is encrypted in some way. And because of that, attackers know that they can hide in that data. They can hide in that encrypted layer so that you can't actually break through. Using an SSL or TLS decryption mechanism inside your firewall or inside another device so that you can then inspect that traffic for something malicious, pluck out files and block them is really sort of the key to stopping the ransomware from ever getting on the system. However, if you can't get perfect there, and I don't expect anyone's going to, that's where your endpoint protection becomes key. And you're not going to be able to block ransomware by just looking for files that match specific signatures. The thing that comes into the network may not even be an executable. It may not even be a piece of ransomware. It may be a threat actor who is accessing your system over RDP and now conducting other actions. What you need at that point is something on your endpoint that can look for behavior that's out of the ordinary, where the system is doing something that is strange, where you can flag that for your SOC and you can shut it down as quickly as possible. This is where EDR, XDR tools are really key to achieving that success and preventing an attacker from moving further inside the network. One of the with the SolarWinds attack that occurred, the SolarWinds attack that came to light in December, organizations who successfully defended against that, and we were one of those organizations, were able to do so by not detecting something that was definitely known as malicious, but an attacker, a system that was acting out of the ordinary. When their Orion server started doing strange things, they were able to shut that down and they didn't experience any further impact. Same is true for ransomware attacks. Being able to detect that oddity, that disconnect from what is norm, is where you have an opportunity to shut it down if it's already made its way to an endpoint. Beyond the endpoint itself, hunting for these types of attacks through automated means is also key. Attackers may achieve each of these steps. They may get through and be operating on one of your systems. At that point, the activity of them either calling out to a command and control server or trying to move inside the network, that's an opportunity based off the data that you have coming in either from network equipment or from endpoint equipment or from your cloud logs, whatever they might be, stitching that information together so that you can automate the discovery of a potential incident and response to that incident is going to be key. Speed is really crucial with ransomware because a single system that has data on it can be encrypted very, very quickly. And if it is encrypted, the attacker can cause you a lot of harm. And if they cause you that harm, then you might be in a position to go and have to pay the ransom or clean up in some other way. And then finally, and we'll talk a little bit more around steps to take if you've actually been compromised with ransomware and you're going through an incident. But if you get to that stage, it's really key to make sure that you've got the right expertise to be able to defend against that threat and clean up from the incident that has occurred. As I noted before, this is a business for the attackers. They want to get paid, and that's what they're going to do. They're going to put all their pressure on making sure that happens. You want to make sure that you have the right people in place to ensure that you don't have to pay up if not necessary, and that if you are going to pay, that you actually are going to get your data back. As I mentioned earlier as well, ransomware is not a single host kind of problem. This is an entire network kind of problem. We've seen ransomware attacks against systems that are deployed in the public cloud. We've seen ransomware attacks that came in through people working at home. We've seen ransomware attacks that directly impact data centers. And the type of visibility and control that you need, as well as automation of detection and response to those attacks, is truly across the entire enterprise. It's not about a system. It's about the value that your IT products are providing to your company that the attacker is trying to disrupt. So I won't walk into all of the aspects of the Palo Alto Networks platform and how it can help you defend against these attacks, but I'll tell you this. When you're designing an architecture for a network to defend against threats, you shouldn't be thinking, I'm defending against ransomware. You should be thinking, I'm defending against adversaries who are going to invade my network And ransomware is one of the business models that they might employ. There are so many different opportunities for an attacker to get inside the network and to conduct their operations. You need to be thinking of it holistically from a defense perspective, because anywhere that your data exists that provides value to your company is a potential target for an adversary. If you have been attacked, if your network has been compromised and you are already being impacted by ransomware in some way, here are some steps that you should go through to defend the network and to recover. So the first is, this is really an organization-wide plan. This isn't something that a single person in your security team or IT team can pick up and say, let me just handle this all on my own. The impact to the company or the organization can be much wider than that. If systems are shut down, if systems are no longer performing their normal function, and if data has been exfiltrated, and there's going to be some public information put out about that, that's going to be a PR question as well, maybe a customer service question. I'm sure many of you, over the course of the recent Exchange vulnerabilities and SolarWinds and all the things that have happened in the last 5 months, may have been getting calls from your vendors and your partners saying, hey, have you been impacted by this or not? If a company is impacted by ransomware and it's a double extortion attack, that is going to be public. If it's a ransomware attack and their services are degraded, that is going to be clear to the people who you're working with. So this is an organization-wide plan. Second, it's really key to have capabilities to isolate hosts. If you have a system that's been compromised and the data, a system that has been compromised and the attacker is potentially going to move inside the network, because that's what they're going to do to ensure that they have the broadest impact. If you can identify that early and isolate that host, you're going to be in a much better position to stop that attack from spreading further. If you have a system that you know has been encrypted already, think really carefully before you reboot the host. When I mentioned before that the ransomware executables themselves are oftentimes written in a way to prevent a forensic analysis from being able to discover keys on the system that might allow you to decrypt the files. Those keys may exist inside of memory. If this is a crucial single system that has been compromised and the data is encrypted, it's possible that those ephemeral keys that were created still exist in memory. So before you go and take action on the host and shut it down, you want to isolate it on the network, but keep it online so that you can ensure that you might be able to extract those keys, or that your forensic or incident response team can. Which brings us to the next step. Either execute your incident response plan with your team or call someone who does this all the time. And that is really important. Like I said, ransomware attacks are occurring continuously. If your organization has not been through one, you may be able to respond to it properly all on your own, but it can't hurt to have some expertise in your corner. People who've dealt with it before, people who can answer questions around it, people who've dealt with the attackers before, people who understand the insurance, cyber insurance, and what the impact is going to be as well. So get your team together, because this is going to require a real team response. And then finally, you shouldn't pay the ransom. We really discourage people from paying the ransom as much as possible. We understand that sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but taking the same perspective as law enforcement and others, as you pay ransoms, it just encourages the attackers to launch more attacks. If we can somehow break that 5-cycle chain and stop the attackers from actually earning an income, it will decrease their likelihood that they're going to go and continue to launch these attacks. But that doesn't seem to be the common case right now. So as we continue to see this occurring, the better that you can do to defend against these attacks, the better. All right. I've got just 2 more slides. So really quickly, some thoughts on crystal ball, like what is the future of ransomware? What do we expect to see more in the future? And there's a couple notes. One, double extortion as a tactic is going to continue to increase. I don't expect it to go away. We used to recommend that people, if they wanted to defend against a ransomware attack, one take that they could use is imagine that your data was destroyed, because that's effectively what ransomware is doing. How would you recover from that from a backup perspective? And that meant a lot of companies could recover. With double extortion, it eliminates that. And I think that's going to continue to be the case, and a rising case for a lot of these different criminal actors. The second thing is an increase in the overall ransom demands. The bigger the impact to an organization or to a municipality, to a government agency, whatever it might be, the larger the ransom payments are going to be, the demands are going to be. As I noted before, there was already a $50 million demand made just earlier in 2021, and we expect that number to continue to increase. The other thing that we expect to see a continued increase in is ransomware as a service. As a model, the sort of maturity of this model growing over time, people specialize in certain places, being able to build and sort of perfect the actual components around encryption of the files, exfiltration of the data, and holding that for ransom is different from compromising networks and everything else that goes into that. So we expect to see ransomware as a service sort of continue to specialize with these affiliate models. All right, just a final few things on resources that are available, and I'll wrap up with a couple more comments. Please look at the Unit 42 blog if you're interested in this topic and other ones. Like I said, 700 reports over the last 7 years. There's a lot of data there. There's a search function. You don't have to go and read them all. Find things that may be interesting to you. The ransomware report that I've been discussing today is available online, so you can go and grab it. There's a lot more detail in the specific threat actors, as well as the different malware families that are being deployed, including those threat assessments, which are also on the blog that you can look at. Last year, we also published an incident response and data breach report, which if you're interested in the impact of incidents beyond ransomware, that report is also available and has a lot more detail on other types of attacks and how intruders are getting to network. And then finally, if you have an incident, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, we have combined Unit 42 Intel with a Unit 42 consulting team to bring the best expertise together in the world on these threats and how to respond to them. And they are standing by and available for people who have this type of incident, and we work a ton of them. So final thoughts before I go into the couple questions here. Ransomware is never going away. This is a problem that's going to continue to grow. I don't see an immediate regulatory solution for this. I don't see an immediate change from a technology perspective that stops this business model from working. The best thing that you can do is take some of the guidance from this report around building a more defendable network, having the right visibility and the right control points to stop attackers of all stripes getting your network, whether they're employing ransomware or something else. Okay, with that, let me go look at the questions that are here. So there's a couple that were related to Colonial Pipeline. I'll just say we don't have a lot of detail about how this attack occurred. Yesterday, FBI in the United States said that they have attributed the attack to the DarkSide group. DarkSide is a ransomware as a service operator who's launched a lot of attacks. Typically, these have been commercially motivated. So the question is this state sponsored? I'll say there's a lot of variation in the world of state sponsored, state initiated attacks. We don't have evidence to indicate at this point. The best that we've got is that it's DarkSide, and this was likely employed for commercial purposes to go and make more money. A question from another attendee: as a beginner, what should a final year CS student pursue in this topic? What I recommend to students in general, if they want to get into security and threat intelligence, is you need to understand the networks and computer systems. So you're already studying computer science, that's great. The flip side of that is to try to understand how to communicate what is important to people. If you're interested in working inside of threat intelligence, a lot of that comes down to conveying the right information to a person at the right time so they can make a better decision. We often do that in writing. We do that through speaking as well. It's not about how much you say, it's about saying the right thing at the right time. Communication is a key factor for anybody working inside of information security. So that is definitely what I ask people to look into. All right. Would encrypting data at rest provide some protection against double extortion? Potentially. It depends on how the data is actually being accessed. So if it's encrypted at rest on a hard drive, but it's accessible through the system that the attacker compromises. So let's say it's encrypted on a hard drive, but it's accessible through a database, and they can make a database query to extract the data out, then it wouldn't necessarily have made a difference. But that is the situation. It really depends on what the user has access to. Most data, someone needs to access at some point. It's not just going to be sort of stripped off of a hard drive in the raw form. If compromised, how can we prevent data disclosure without paying the ransom, even if we manage to decrypt or restore? So there are different opportunities where you might be able to influence the attacker. Obviously, they just want to get paid. Depending on what data was stolen, you really have to understand what is the risk to your organization of that information being leaked. In some cases, people may choose just to leak the information themselves. Maybe it's not that sensitive, but if there is potential impact from a regulatory perspective or obviously from a reputation perspective, you've really got to take that into account of what the impact is going to be and make that part of that calculation overall. Can we mention some techniques to isolate infected resources? So there's different ways that you can isolate a device. One of the, I think the best opportunity to do this is at the network layer. There are different technologies that enable this from a sort of straight up networking perspective by sort of moving systems from one VLAN to another VLAN. Next generation firewalls like Palo Alto Networks makes, as well as other organizations, also have the capability to isolate devices as far as the kind of interactions that they can create. But I would say look into how you can perform network isolation with the equipment you have today. If it doesn't meet those needs, then you might need to go and look at something else. And the key is something that can be automated so that you can quickly isolate that device that belongs to a specific user, a specific system, so that it can't continue to spread throughout the network. Let's see. One person is noting that they disagree. You should, if a company's hit with ransomware and no one can help, the only way to get the business back up is to pay. I completely agree. I totally understand that perspective. We don't want people to pay the ransom because it does encourage this cycle of payment, but that doesn't mean that that's the right calculation. If I was running a hospital and we were shut down and I had patients who weren't getting care and I could make that go away for, let's say, $10,000, that's not a difficult decision to make. That's a pretty easy one. And it does encourage this continued cycle. So we don't want people to do that. But if they are, if they have an opportunity not to do it, I would say it's definitely something that people should pursue. All right, I think we got time for one more question. Please compare ransomware attacks against databases versus files. So there are certainly different, encrypting a database can be more complicated than encrypting a file. I mean, at the end of the day, databases are effectively just files that are stored on a system, but the way that they're accessed is different. And I'll tell you, as I've seen in some cases where an attacker did go to encrypt a database, oftentimes they do so or in some cases at least, they do so in ways that are not very data friendly. So you may be able to encrypt a database, and we saw this with MongoDB databases that were exposed to the internet through the database itself, where you extract the data out, you encrypt it, you stuff it back in, or you encrypt it in place through the database operations. In some cases, we've seen attackers who use a effectively file-based encryption system on a database file. And anyone who has been trying to move or modify a file that's being used for a database while it's actually being accessed by the database software knows that you can't just mess with these things. Oftentimes you're going to corrupt that data in the process. And we have seen cases where the encryption, well, the decryption for those files is not possible simply because the data was being still overwritten throughout the process of the encryption, which destroyed it instead. So it's definitely a little bit more complicated from the attacker's perspective. From the victim's perspective, knowing what data has been impacted and how it's accessed is also an important element. All right, I think that is the very end of our time. So thanks everyone for asking questions. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the group for allowing me to come and talk with you all about ransomware. With that, I'll go ahead and stop my share and sign off. Thank you.